beginning of one of my leadership classes, I do a quick literature review, and I tell my students about two books written in the middle 90s by author James Champion during the era when re-engineering was popular. I don't know whether you remember that period. I was in grad school then, or I had just finished grad school. I was working with a major oil company. So these kinds of things really began to take on a significance to me. The two books, the first one in the early 90s was called Re-Engineering the Corporation. And what re-engineering was, it was taking a look at the inside of your business to see where you could cut. And what the end result was, it flattened organizations. At one point they were very tall, and all of a sudden they got rid of all these middle managers, and there were more direct reports to upper managers, but it flattened organizations. Well, it put a lot of pressure on those upper level managers. And it wasn't but a year and a half later his second book came out, entitled Re-Engineering Management. And what he was trying to show was that you cannot change something unless you change people. And there's a process that you have to go through to get people from one point to another before you can successfully change it, especially something as significant as what we're trying to do at Watts. I believe that the nations of West Africa, personally, may be the launching pad for the spread of the gospel into North Africa in ways that we have never seen in modern history. And you know, this whole Ebola crisis, I don't know what the outcome is going to be, but I can assure you that in some way it is going to glorify God. Yes. And it could open up those West African nations in ways we have never seen before. And we can have people by the tens of thousands pouring into West Africa, reaching into those churches and into those nations. They border the areas of North Africa where there are the most unreached people groups left in the world. And folks, if you know what Matthew 24:14 says, and this gospel will be preached to all people groups, and then the end will come. What a great opportunity. God has put Nigeria there, put Watts in Lagos as a leadership development institution for all of West Africa. And all we have to do is see Watts' success through the next decade or two or three. Second, you need to be proactive rather than reactive. In many organizations, boards in particular, I think, are lulled into states of what's called docility, where they are so confident in one person's leadership that they neglect the heavier responsibilities of their roles as leaders. Regardless of who the leader of an organization is, proactivity will demonstrate itself in practices like accountability, as well as making others more productive, more efficient, more effective in the roles that they have. Too often, older organizations can be so heavily dependent on founders that danger, and in many cases, disaster will creep up, and it won't be seen until it's too late. Those need to be worked through proactively so that you don't get into situations where attention and crisis comes along. In our line of work, and I think that I can make a case for any line of work where a Christian is involved, the further out ahead we are, the better we will make an organization. The only danger is, if you get out too far and look back and there's nobody there, you're in trouble. Now, there's also this concept of the divine partnership to consider. We need to make the presumption, and it's a presumption. We can presume that God is at work.
Yes.
Okay, behind the scenes, in His work of preparation. In a recent meeting with a good friend of Watts, we were discussing the issue of leadership transition, and I posed the question to him, what might be a good biblical model to look at from Scripture that might be used as a good Bible study to bring people along, to help them understand God's work in people's lives behind the scene. And, you know, there's a lot of them there. But he settled on Elijah and Elisha. And for 30 minutes he just expounded on how this is such a perfect Bible study to conduct for people that we're trying to communicate with about this, giving details, giving principles, identifying issues related to these two great leaders in Israel's history. But one thing really struck me. It was very clear that the reason for Elisha's successful ministry was how when Elijah was doing his work for God in his visible ministry, God was doing his invisible work in the life of Elisha. And when it was Elisha's time to arise, he was ready. I am confident that we can go into places with leaders, from graduates from Watts, and fully expect to have God to have been there, even though we may not have heard anything, any stories about what's going on. With our venture into West Africa and North Africa, these kinds of things are becoming more and more prominent in our thinking. So we've picked up several different books: Miraculous Movements, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, and this, you hear story after story after story. In fact, Miraculous Movements, the subtitle of the book, is how hundreds of thousands of Muslims are falling in love with Jesus.
Praise God.
And they're falling in love with Jesus because God is doing things behind the scenes that we aren't even aware of until we read them in these books written by these people who've had these experiences. And you may have heard some of them. But when you go to a place and you don't see any evidence, still presume that God has been at work. You have to have the presumption of divine partnership. There's this importance of leadership succession and development, which is paramount in the heart of our provost and the board of Friends of Watts and the governing board of Watts, and I'm sure many of you here. It's important too. When I was in my middle 20s, I caught a glimpse of how this occurs. I was a seminary student in Portland, Oregon. I was working in the petroleum warehouse on the swing shift for a major oil company. The terminal superintendent was a good Christian man I'd met at church. I needed a job. He gave me one. Over the next 2 years, he let me experience, unlike anybody else at the terminal, he let me experience many different aspects of this distribution terminal operation. At the end of 2 years, he sat me down And he asked me what I was going to do with the rest of my life. At that point, I wasn't real sure. So he encouraged me, well, why don't you come to work and make a career of working with this particular oil company? And then having no clear direction from the Lord about ministry, after 2 years of seminary, I said, sure. So, within a few months, he had moved me out of Portland. I moved to Seattle, and over the next 6 years, I had several successive promotions and raises and levels of responsibility until, at some point, God called me to ministry, and I left. But I could see in him the need to find people like me. And he was looking all over the distribution terminal, and every top-level manager in that division was always looking for young people to come in, because that's the only way that company was going to succeed from generation to generation. You know where they got that model from? Matthew 28, 16 through 20. They're making their disciples. And what we need to do is understand the importance of leadership, succession, and development. And I want to tell you that is something that the provost has a deep-seated love for, and you see it at Watts. You know, if organizations, churches want to be successful, they've got to be doing those kinds of things. I've been in my position now for 6 months. I have 3 young men in mind that I hope to be working with over the next several years who would be good replacements for me. I hope to find a half a dozen more. Get them further engaged in the work in Africa, get them up the learning curve regarding Watts, get them over there, get them to know William, the board, and other significant ingredients to further knit them to Watts and to Friends of Watts. I'm convinced that with the proper attention paid to Watts and Friends of Watts in the short term, we will, through God's help, navigate the change necessary to move us through the short term so that we can learn what God will have us do in the long term. I think we're on the right track at this point. We'll just have to wait and see what the Lord has for us. We'll keep our eyes open. Thank you.